Beginner's Guide to Language Learning Motivation, how to stay motivated. I'm not going to waste your time, guys. Getting demotivated is something that does happen to every single language learner constantly. Probably, it might even happen more than you actually are motivated. And it is definitely a pain. So more motivation obviously means that you're more driven to learn the language and feel your progress and all that stuff. Unfortunately, when you have less motivation, you basically stop trying and you get nowhere. So because it's a big problem and one that I actually have done really well with improving myself, I've decided to make this video. So by the end of this video, you'll understand how motivation works as fuel, how to boost your motivation, and how to actually work without motivation as well to basically blast your progress through the roof and to, not have to give up whenever you don't feel like it, because I will show you the tips and tricks of how you can actually keep making progress. So yeah, if you do like this kind of educational content on language learning, guys, definitely hit the subscribe button. It does really help the channel. But with that said, let's go. So first, how does motivation actually work? We need to understand that before we go into how to fix kind of motivation related problems. So motivation, I'm going to define as a reason for acting in a certain way, such as you have no reason to move your hand away from something until you burn it, for example. You need an actual reason to jump back from something. And with language learning, it's actually go out of your way to do something that language learning is fun, but it's still like learning and studying. So you kind of need a reason to do it. If you don't have motivation to learn a language, I understand that it's obviously going to be hard to do, right? So that means that motivation is fuel. We use it to drive our actions and eventually make progress. Because if we run out of motivation, we run out of fuel and we stop actually doing things. So look at this kind of diagram I've made. So I've got on one side, I've got motivation. So when you emotionally feel like doing something, motivation is fuel that goes towards your actions. Motivation fuels what you do. And what you do fuels your progress. So if you don't have motivation, you don't do the actions that are required to make progress. For example, listening to a podcast in a language. And if you don't do that, you don't actually get any progress. So as you can see, cutting off motivation kind of cuts it off from the beginning. So here is what the actual problem is. When you emotionally feel like doing something, is very, very contingent on wishy-washy emotions, basically, because when you don't feel like doing something, you're obviously not going anywhere. And that is kind of the root problem here. So because you don't have full control over your feelings, unless you actually do something about this, basically your feelings exclusively control whether or not you can make progress in a language. And of course that means when most of the time you don't actually feel like studying or anything, for example, you're just not going to make progress. So what that does leave us with is two possible solutions, and I'm going to go over these two because these are the two solutions to letting your emotions and your motivation kind of get in the way of making progress in a language. So the two possible solutions are to either boost our motivation or use a different fuel source. So because our motivation is kind of stagnant half the time, for example, that means half the time it can't fuel our actions, which means it can't fuel our progress. But of course, if we manage to boost our motivation somehow, if that's even possible, then that would then mean that we have more motivation, which means more fuel for your actions, which means more progress. So theoretically, this could work. The second thing to do is, instead of using motivation, to use a different fuel source. And we're going to talk about that as well. But first things first, boosting motivation. So the eternal truth is that every beginner basically finds themselves demotivated at some point. It doesn't matter if it's language learning, exercise, committing to learning a musical instrument, literally anything. At some point and consistently, you're going to find yourself demotivated and not feeling like doing it. This is called the motivation dip, and it's really annoying because even when you want to do something, within you do want to learn a language, right? You think it's cool. You're not just forcing yourself to do something that someone else has told you to do. Unless you're learning a language at school, in which case I feel sorry for you because the way they teach it in school is really bad. But yeah, the motivation dip is literally just a point in time where your motivation for something randomly declines. There's not really a reason for it. Nothing traumatic has happened to you to stop you from wanting to learn a language. You just don't feel like it sometimes. And the solution to the motivation dip, which is going to actually boost your motivation, is to recognize what the difference between short and long-term motivation is. When people say, I lost motivation, they're not actually talking about losing long-term motivation. They're talking about losing short-term motivation. So short-term motivation is basically your emotions, literally what we talked about before. When we talked about how motivation is fuel, we're talking about short-term motivation. You literally feel like doing something. It's like when you got lots of energy and you feel like lifting weights or going for a run. That's the short-term motivation. It's emotional. Long-term motivation isn't emotional. It's what your actual goal is. So for example, when you set yourself the goal of, for example, being able to speak a language, you're setting that goal not because you feel like it in the moment, unless you're like a really bad goal setter. You're setting that goal because you want to be able to speak that language, because you want to go to that country, you want to talk to a loved one, you want to work there. Literally any reason, whatever your reason is for learning that language, that's your long-term motivation. When you're losing motivation, you're not losing your long-term motivation. You still want to be able to talk to that loved one. You still want to be able to work in that country. You still want to be able to travel. If I said to you, I can snap my fingers and make you able to speak that language, you'd say yes because you still want to do it. If I asked you if I could snap my fingers and make you really good at origami or something, like maybe you like origami, but pick something you don't really care about. If I said I'll snap my fingers and you can do that, you'd probably still say yes, because like, why not? But like, you wouldn't really care that much. If I said I could snap my fingers and give you the ability to speak the language you're learning right now, of course you'd say yes. Even if you were completely demotivated, you'd be like, hell yeah, I want that. So you're actually losing short-term motivation. Therefore, what we actually need to do is regain that kind of short-term emotional fire that the long-term motivation doesn't provide. So here is what you actually need to do. So 3 steps, really, really simple as well. Recognize nobody in history has ever tried to regain short-term motivation for something that they didn't have long-term motivation for. The only reason you're watching this video on language learning motivation is because you want to learn a language. If you didn't give a shit about learning a language, you wouldn't be trying to regain your short-term emotional motivation. Like, oh, I don't feel like studying. You wouldn't care if you don't feel like studying. Pick something you don't care about again. Say like windsurfing. If you're a professional windsurfer, I apologize. That randomly just came into my head. But say you lose short-term motivation to windsurf. You wake up one day and just feel like, I don't feel like windsurfing. Who cares? Because you don't want to become a professional windsurfer. You have no interest in it. I have no interest personally in watercolor painting today. And watercolor painting, I'm not allergic to it, but I just don't care. I have no interest in becoming better at watercolor painting. I've never watched a video on how to regain my short-term motivation for watercolor painting because I have no interest in doing it. You are here because you do want to learn a language. Only problem is you don't feel like it right now. So recognize that you do actually want to learn a language, even if you don't feel like it right now. Recognize is step number 1. It's pretty important. The too long didn't listen is if you didn't actually want to learn a language, you wouldn't care that you didn't feel like it, and that is important. Step number 2 is sell yourself. Recognize number 1. Number 2, sell yourself, the dream. So, for example, what salesmen actually do when they're trying to sell someone something, be it, any kind of salesman, I'm sure you've talked to at least one, is they don't actually sell them what they're selling them, they sell them the dream. So a salesperson who's selling someone a gym membership, for example, random thing that just popped into my mind because I just watched an Alex Hormozi video. Instead of selling them, okay, so what you're going to do is we're going to give you this gym membership and you're going to be able to work out here every day of the week. You're going to be able to lift weights and all that stuff. They don't really say that. What they actually say is we're going to give you the gym membership, and what's going to happen is you're going to get super fit and strong. You're going to be really healthy. You're going to look great. And they sell them the actual dream, not like the T's and C's. Obviously the T's and C's are important, but they sell them the result of what they're going to buy. Same goes for anything. Same goes for like anything, literally anything. Pick something and then think about it. They're actually selling them the dream. So maybe it's traveling to exotic places before. Maybe it's the freedom to work somewhere, talking to a loved one. Any of the reasons I just said before could be literal ego. Ego is fine when it comes to making progress. If you literally want to learn a language, and one of the big reasons is like you just want to be able to talk another language, you think it makes you smarter. It does make you smarter, and yeah, that is part of the reason I like learning languages, is because I like being able to say I can speak another language. That's fine, I'll admit it. But sell yourself the dream. Pretend you're the salesman, but you're also selling to yourself. So when you don't feel like language learning, don't say, oh, I don't feel like language learning. Literally tell yourself you're learning a language so that you can tell other people you speak another language. You can put it on your resume. You can go talk to people in that country. You can talk to a loved one. Literally sell yourself why you want to learn that language. And then the third thing to do is understand. Recognize the growth mindset and recognize that you only make progress by putting effort in. If you don't actually put, like just like we had before, we had this diagram, didn't we? If you don't actually have action, like, where's the other one? If you don't actually take action here, you will never get the result. Even if you have the motivation and you just choose not to take any actions, you won't get the result. It has to go through, I just pointed at the screen with my finger and realized you can't see it. It has to go through this logical path. So recognize that to actually make progress, you do need to put effort in. That is the growth mindset. Progress comes from effort. Results are the product of the effort you put in. Remember these things, 3 things. Recognize, sell, understand, RSU. Recognize that you do want to learn a language even when you don't feel like doing it. Sell yourself why you want to learn the language, and then understand you will only get there from A to B if you put effort in. And that won't work every single time. It isn't a perfect system, but bloody hell does it work as an affirmation. And there have been times when I don't feel like it. I literally tell myself, I want to learn a language. I want to be able to learn a language so I can travel and keep making videos and build a really big YouTube channel. I'm just being honest, that's why. And I understand the only way I'm going to get there is if I stop, being bored of language learning, going, I don't feel like it right now. And instead of listening to music, put the goddamn headphones in and listen to a Russian podcast when I'm going for a run, because I know that's going to take me one step closer, and I recognize that. So guys, definitely try that. Comment down below. We're not finished the video, by the way, but comment down below how it worked for you. I'd be interested to see, because that is not something I've really heard anyone talk about, and oh my God, it does actually work. Step 2 is working without motivation. So although we've talked about how to boost your motivation, it's still not going to always work. I'm just going to be honest. It doesn't always work. Sometimes you're really like, oh shit, like I really don't feel like language learning. So what is the other option? The other option, of course, is to use another fuel source down here. But what is that? Well, of course, if we do use another fuel source, we don't have to rely on motivation. So if we're out of motivation, we can plug this other fuel source in and use that to fuel our progress. And theoretically, that would work. But what is this other fuel source? Well, let's get one thing straight first. Motivation is fickle and inherently uncontrollable, which means if it is your only fuel source, you're going to be running on empty some of the time. The obvious solution, blah, 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 is to use a second fuel source that doesn't disappear when you don't feel like learning, because obviously motivation disappears when you don't feel like learning. This second fuel source is called discipline. And I'm sure you've heard that word before, but a lot of people actually don't know what the word means. So just let me explain it. If you already know what it means, good on you, because it's a really important word to know the meaning of. But discipline is basically doing the hard thing even when you don't feel like it. For example, language learning, or for example, exercise when you don't feel like it, or with a musical instrument, you practice even when you don't feel like it. It's kind of like the ability to do something that is important, cross the line from A to B one step closer, but you don't actually feel like doing it. And discipline is a skill, and like any skill, it can be upgraded. So if you have really weak discipline, when you don't feel like doing something, you're just not going to do it. When you have really, really strong discipline, like a professional athlete, for example, or honestly, a lot of businessmen who work very, very long days, for example, it could be anyone who has high discipline. With very strong discipline, you're able to force yourself to do things that you don't emotionally feel like in the moment. And the stronger your discipline is, the easier it gets, just because you're affected less by your emotions. So how do we actually start using discipline as this second fuel source to continue learning even when we don't feel like? What you need to do is realize that, like anything else, like language learning, discipline is a skill. And like any skill, as I said before, you can improve it. The stronger your discipline, the easier doing things you don't like becomes. And the way you build discipline is purely through repetition. So here's what you do. The steps to improve discipline are this. 1, give yourself a difficult task. Write it down in a habit tracker or a to-do list. So for example, say you're really undisciplined at language learning, which I know at least somebody listening to me right now is. You set yourself goals and you just never do them. You want to learn a language and you just don't do stuff. Set yourself one goal for tomorrow. One goal. It can be stupidly easy if you want. And in fact, that is one of actually the best things to do, because a lot of people have a little bit of an ego, I would say, I know I said ego is good for making progress, but ego is bad when it comes to setting yourself like a to-do list, because some people set themselves, I actually do this as well sometimes when I'm setting myself the amount of videos I'm going to record in one day, and then it's unrealistic. But basically, if you set yourself too difficult of things to do, say you set yourself going to read one chapter of a book, and then you might go to do it and it's just too difficult, you can't do it. Set yourself the goal of reading one word in a book or one sentence in a book in a different language. Set yourself the goal of watching one language learning video of people talking in the language that you're learning. Even if you don't understand, it can be 2 minutes, literally. Set yourself a stupidly easy goal. Write it down, though. You can't just think it, and I want you to write it down on paper. Write it down in a to-do list or a habit tracker with a box next to it that you can tick. Then what you need to do is hold accountability and complete the task. Even if you don't feel like doing it, hopefully it isn't too hard because you set yourself a stupidly easy task. But the point of this isn't to set yourself a really hard task because you're so disciplined. You're not disciplined. You haven't actually upgraded your discipline as a skill. So set yourself a task that you know you can complete, but you don't usually do, and then tick it off. So you don't usually do something, say it's watch 2 minutes of a language learning video as soon as you wake up. As soon as you wake up, literally just force yourself to do it. It might be a little bit difficult, but just do it. It's only one task. You can do it. Tick it off. The next thing to do after you've ticked it off is step 3. Congratulate yourself. look at the win and say, wow, I literally have made progress. I've gone from doing 0 things to 1 thing. I can't even plot that mathematically because anything times 0 is still 0. So I can't even say it's a 100% improvement. But you've done it. And then the next day, you can either set yourself the same thing, you can make it a little bit harder, or you can set 2 things that are equally as hard. And what that's called is progressive overload. Progressive overload is a gym term where over time, obviously, Arnold Schwarzenegger started out lifting normal size weights and he didn't just go straight to the really heavy ones. But of course, when he got stronger, he couldn't just stay on the normal weights. He had to upgrade them over time. So basically what you need to do with this and with any other skill is to slowly make it more intense over time. So if you want to get better at language learning, you start with setting yourself 1 goal, and then eventually you might be setting yourself 5 goals, and you're going to read a chapter instead of 1 word. Instead of watching 1 2-minute video, you're going to listen to a 1-hour podcast. Things like that. Just find ways to make the to-do list or the habit tracker slightly more intense, and that is how you actually build your discipline up. And you'll find that when you're doing maybe 5 things a day on the language learning thing, you're doing 2 sets of flashcards, you're reading 1 chapter, you're listening to 20 minutes of a podcast while you do something, you just whatever, anything like that, you'll find it's actually easier. And if you went back to the time where you only had to write 1 thing, it would be too easy. That's progressive overload, and that is how you build discipline. Over time, you will make progress and you will become better at completing crucial tasks. But yeah, guys, that is the video. If you do have any questions, comment them down below. Happy to help. But just to sum it up, motivation is a fickle thing and you can't rely on it. But combining both the skills of boosting your motivation, just that little bit, and discipline will kind of get you through the kind of motivation dips that crushed most people's progress. And in fact, understanding these skills isn't just good for language learning, they'll help you in all areas of life. So definitely check out the links to my website and Discord, guys, in the description. Smash the subscribe button because I do appreciate it. I do try and put in, you can probably understand from this video, I actually do care. I do want you guys to be better at language learning. Even though it's just a YouTube video, I want to see you guys succeed. So yeah, appreciate it. Hit me up in the Discord if you want, and have a good one.